Kentucky National Guard members were awarded for their acts of bravery during the Kentucky floods this morning. Destiny Quinn joins us now with details on how they were honored in Frankfort. Destiny?
Sergeant First Class Jeremy Lowe and Staff Sergeant Ryan Hunter were presented with the Kentucky Medal for Valor. The heroic missions took place during the 2022 historic floods in eastern Kentucky. 241 people were rescued. The award is presented to Kentucky National Guard members who have distinguished themselves at the risk of their life and gone above and beyond the call of duty. After receiving the award, Sergeant First Class Lowe spoke about what the award means to him.
This award is just not a recognition of the actions of two flight paramedics. It's a testament to the extraordinary teamwork, bravery, and dedication of countless of individuals and organizations that united during the devastating floods.
Sergeant Lowe was a part of the group that had a vision over a decade ago to create the rescue program that operates now. In the past 2 decades, service members have only been recognized like this 7 times. The ceremony today took place in the Capitol Rotunda. Victor?
Destiny.